Hey, dear friends, how are you? I hope you're well. I am feeling better than yesterday, but I got a little cold, or what people call the man flu. I try not to bitch, moan, and complain too much, but I'm a little under the weather, and it might look like I am. I mean, I don't know. I'm staring at this camera like, damn, I don't look so good today, but I definitely wanted to give y'all a video because I haven't done one this week. And I have promised that to you, and I try to come through on that kind of stuff. So, what I've been thinking about, I was thinking about what to do. So, I got to keep this water with me because got to stay hydrated when you're sick. What I wanted to talk about today was this notion of like doing good works for the Lord, or striving, or climbing Jacob's ladder, or something to that effect. And I just published a short little article on my Pathos blog about this sort of thing. And Mike and I have been talking about this sort of idea in our podcast that's going to be launching in May. And this whole idea of like putting in work for God. And it just seems it's like a paradox, and I'll explain that. You know me, I grew up in the evangelical church. I grew up with the belief that you had to win souls for the Lord. You had to get out there and grind. You had to maybe go to street corners and proselytize. You had to get people to the altar to raise their hand that, I want to devote my life to Jesus. I want to give my heart to God. And all that is fine and well, I suppose, in a certain context. But it seems that for some people, maybe this is an aside, I'm an introvert, I have depression, I have social anxiety. I've had anxiety and depression since my teenage years, and so that's just not such an easy task to do. And especially when there's like eternal consequences. There's this passage in Revelation 3 about the cold and the hot and the lukewarm person, and it's not the cold or the hot person that gets spit out of God's mouth, it's the lukewarm Christian, as we've interpreted it. So if you're not doing anything for God, God's going to spit you out. And that is just such a burden, and it's such a thing to have to be weighing on us. And so what happens, at least in my experience and a lot of other people's experience, is that you don't end up doing anything. It's like the deer in the headlights sort of thing. When there's this great fear, you sort of freeze, and you play dead almost. But then on the flip side, the place where I've come to now is that there's really nothing to do. There's nothing you ought to do. There's nothing you should do. Oughts and shoulds are not the right approach. What the right approach? What do you want to do? What do you see as good? What do you see as beautiful? What do you see as true? And when you're liberated from that striving, from that ladder climbing, and you can do what James Allison says is relax into the arms of God, relax into the arms of Papa, into the Father's arms. You actually want to do more. You want to create things. You want to talk to people. You think you do have some good news, some euangelion. I think that's how you pronounce it. Correct me if I'm wrong. The gospel, the good news. It's not about what you need to do. First and foremost, it's about what's been done. And that's how I see the gospel as, and that's how I think Paul saw it as. It's already about what God has done. What's done is done, whether you know it or not. Much better to know it and use that to motivate you to actually do something. But not because you should, not because there's a gun to your head, not because if you don't, there's some sort of eternal consequence awaiting you. In the article, I call it a divine Auschwitz. That does not motivate anyone. I mean, I guess it can motivate you a bit. Fear motivates. Fear can, in its proper sense, fear is not a bad thing. Fight or flight. If you're on a run and a mountain lion attacks you, yeah, fear response is appropriate. But when it comes to God, if God is love, then there is no fear in love, then there is no fear in God. And I know there's that proverb that I always butcher it. The beginning, fuck. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. There it is. It's somewhere in my cluttered mind. But I, for one, fear. I don't see it as fear as in like afraid. I mean fear in terms of awe. Sure, and I believe that's what it actually means in Hebrew. That's the connotation. But this business of using fear to motivate us to proselytize, I don't think it works. It doesn't work for a lot of people, and it's exhausting. And that's why I entitled that last blog entry, Christianity should not be this exhausting. And yeah, sure, we're all tired. We all grind. I've got 5 sources of income, but I want to keep on grinding because this is my passion. And thanks to you lovely folks, I'm able to do that more and more now, but it's not an ought or a should. It's my desire and my passion of what I want to do. What I think is beneficial for my life, others' lives, and not because I have to. And I feel as if Christianity has become more about what you have to do. You got to get it right. You got to say the right prayer. You got to put in this and this, or this is going to happen. It's all an economy of exchange, a quid pro quo. And this is just an unsustainable model, and it's a good thing that this model is sort of falling apart. And I know that there's studies that say the evangelical church is dying, and then there's some that say it's not, it's thriving. I wish that model was dying because it shouldn't be how we live our lives. I shouldn't count up all the things my wife has done for me and say, well, okay, well, I'm going to retribute those by doing X, Y, and Z. This is not how love operates. It shouldn't be, anyway. It shouldn't be a thing with, if my daughter does this and this and this and needs some discipline or correction, it should be led by grace. The correction or the sitting down and talking to her about something, call it punishment if you want. I don't think that's the right word. Correction seems better. It's led by grace. It's not a you did X, Y, and Z and that deserves this time out, this, and this. That's how our justice system works, sure. I don't think it's the best model. I think everything has to be led by grace, and that is it's a scary notion for a lot of people because they feel as if there's too much grace, hyper grace, that's redundant. It's a tautology, I think. They fear as if you're just going to take advantage of it. Without the shoulds and the oughts and the threat of punishment, you're not going to do anything. You're just going to sit idly by and you're going to be that lukewarm Christian. But I have found that grace is not only liberating, but it liberates us to want to do something, to want to change the world, to want to bring justice for the poor, and sight to the blind, and food for the hungry. All those good things that Jesus talks about in Luke 4, and he's announcing the day of Jubilee, and he's going to bring all those things. I don't think because he feels, I have to do this, or my Father's going to punish me forever. No, it's because it's the right thing to do, and it stands on its own. The gospel should stand on its own. You should, you should. I try not to say you should, but if your gospel doesn't stand on its own, let me try to fix the lighting a little bit. If there's this need for a quid pro quo or an economy of exchange, then I don't know how it's good news. It's the news of every other religious system. It's the news of every other god or gods or goddesses or cultures that we've been doing forever. It's not really good news at all. It's not news. It's just another day. It seems paramount that if Christianity is going to be relevant in the future, it has to start with grace. It has to start with this relaxing into the arms of God. God is God the Father, not the Godfather. I use that analogy in the article as well. It seems as if you got to do this to stay right with the family. You got to be doing this and this and this and this, and if you don't, well, you're kind of out, or God's going to spit you out. We might not kick you out of the church because we're hoping you'll change your ways, but if you don't, sorry. This is the exchange economy we live in, and it's so unsustainable for many, many, many people. And I think it's unsustainable for a faith tradition, and there's always going to be people who are living very religious lives. But to my mind, religion or religious or pure is not the same thing as holy. And Nadia Bolz-Weber points this out in her new book, Shameless. We kind of conflate purity with holiness, but it's not necessarily so. We have this sacred and secular divide, but there seems to be no sacred and secular divide. Everything is sacred. And yeah, I've just found it to be so exhausting to try to live in that pure world, that Christian world. And I have no problems calling myself a Christian still. I consider myself a Christian, if you want to use that term. But not the type of Christianity many of us have grown up in or been a part of, simply because it seems like it's set up for certain types of people. It's definitely set up for extroverts. If you can go talk to people on the street corner, you might have some success in feeling good about your religion, your faith. If you've won over a couple people, they're like, yeah, I want to give my heart to God. I want to repent. I want to believe. And you see some of that. Well, great. But some of us just can't talk to people like that. Some of us are introverted. But the whole church culture does not seem conducive to those who are introverted, who can stand up and raise their hand when the pastor says, who wants to come to the altar, and all this nonsense to us extra. It's paralyzing. My God. I never could do that. I never won any souls for the Lord growing up. Not one. Not one. And it wasn't for a lack of wanting to. I wanted to have that evidence that I was heaven bound rather than hell bound. I just, it didn't work for me. It didn't work for me. I could play music, I could play worship and stuff like that, but talking to people and really getting into people's lives, and telling them, I've got some good news for you. You're going to go to heaven if you do this, instead of going to this place of horrible torture. It seems like we should all be talking. I mean, if you believe in hell, we should all be talking to people all the time. It seems paramount. I find it kind of odd that we as Christians, those who do believe in hell, aren't talking to people all the fucking time, if it's that important. So I always kind of laugh to myself and wonder, do people actually believe this? It seems like they should be a little more concerned if the fate of someone is eternally bound when they die. And most Christians, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, are worried about what they're doing today, what their schedule's like, what's their budget like, how's their job going, are they selling enough stuff to make commission to pay bills, and blah 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 blah, what their favorite team is doing. All those things are fine and dandy, but when you live with an eschatology that says at least half of us, I'm sure, most of us are going to burn forever, seems like they'd be out there grinding, standing on a box, yelling at people. And I'm not saying you should. Those people are assholes and come across as assholes, the Ray Comforts of the world. I'm not saying he's an asshole in his personal life, but he certainly presents as one. I dealt with one person when I was at Chico State getting my bachelor's degree. This person, he told me I was going to hell because I have tattoos, and I just thought it was so ridiculous. wanted to ask, I didn't talk to him. I wanted to ask him, like, how many people have you actually impacted in a positive way where they're like, yeah, this sounds great. This sounds like good news. No, most people were like, yeah, your God's an ass. I mean, he's not a nice guy. Wouldn't call God love in that point, but that's neither here nor there. But it seems more people would be out there doing that, but maybe they're just as exhausted, and maybe they're thinking these internal thoughts. And some of us actually wrestle with them a little more instead of pushing them to the background. I think a lot of people probably push their exhaustion to the background. They say, this is exhausting. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want to have to talk to people about this and tell them they're going to hell if they don't repent and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I don't know the psychology behind everyone. Not sure what everyone's dealing with, but I have found that it is truly liberating, this idea, the Buddhists would say, this non-grasping. I think that goes along the lines of what James Allison is saying, how we experience God. We relax into God's arms. And I can almost picture like us striving up this ladder, trying to get to the divine, and then realizing all we got to do is let go and trust that when we fall back, the Father always has us. I think that's the emphasis on, we call it the prodigal son story. I think we need to pay attention more to the Father in that story. I don't think that story, the emphasis of that story, of course we can draw meaning, it's a parable, we're going to draw infinite meaning from it. We can draw meaning about the younger brother, about the older brother. I think we need to pay more attention to the Father in that story. The Father comes running down the driveway. Pardon my anachronism. Running down the lane, running down to greet the son who has come back, or he sees him off in the distance. And this would have been very countercultural. And we see the brother, the older brother, getting so pissed off. I've been striving. I've been doing all this. I've been grinding. I've been doing all the right things. And you're going to give this jerk a party, and he blew his inheritance. He screwed up. He ended up in the pigsty eating the slop, and you're going to throw him a party? It's like, yeah, that's the nature of God right there, is that it's not about what you've done. It's not about the mistakes you've made. Of course, those are important in a certain sense. But again, the lens through which we view all those things is that the Father is grace. Unconditional grace, unconditional mercy, unconditional love. The minute we put a condition on it, it's no longer love. It's no longer grace. It's no longer mercy. At least not in the truest, purest sense. I saw this, I don't know if it was a meme or if it was on Facebook. There was this like church sign, those church signs they have out there, and there's a lot of funny ones. And it was something about like, pardon me, it was something to the effect about God's unconditional grace, and then it listed a condition. It's like, that's not, do you understand the meaning of the word unconditional? We don't. We put conditions on God's love and grace and mercy and compassion. And the New Testament emphasis, I think it's in Ephesians. No, it might be in Philippians. I like I said, I got this man flu, so it's hard to think of the actual passages. But I believe it's in Philippians actually. It's like how wide, how deep, how long is the love of God. It's wider and broader and deeper and higher than any of our linguistical attempts can describe it as. So whatever we say about God's nature, about God's love, about all this, it pales in comparison to the actuality of those things. We can talk about God's unconditional love, but God's actual, that's only pointing at it. It's only pointing at the moon. It's not the moon. So that is only pointing at the reality of the breadth and depth of God's actual character, of God's actual nature, of the qualities of all the things we say about God. It's always bigger and wider and broader. And that is the opposite of exhausting. the exhausting Christianity that many of us have been a part of is just Selah, adios, goodbye. Like, ain't nobody got time for that, you know. I'd much rather live in the liberating truth that there's nothing you can do to change God's mind about you. And that scares some people, but it should liberate us. It should free us. We should be free to love. Nod to Jamal. And that's what I have found. And I'm tired. I'm tired from grinding. I got 5 jobs, but I love it. I love doing it. And I would happily do it because it's not exhausting. I think exhausted and tired are much different. I don't feel spiritually exhausted or mentally exhausted, even when my body and mind are tired. And that's, I think, first and foremost, because of the awe-inspiring nature of God and God's love. And it's also because of you fine folks who have reached into your pockets to help me out, and I've been able to not be so living month to month and barely month to month. And so that's been really helpful too. So, but first and foremost, I feel like my life in the last, ever since I've experienced this awe-inspiring love of God, it's just been such a weight off my shoulders. I'm sure that many of you have experienced the same thing and know what I'm talking about. The difference, the contrast between religious Christianity and a Christianity that is centered first and foremost on the grace and love of God, rather than something you have to do or ought to do. So anyway, thanks for listening. Pardon my nasally voice today. I feel like I got to blow my nose again. I thank you so much for supporting me. I hope this content blesses you and that you, I hope it brings you peace and stillness. And peace and love. See you next time, and I'll see you out there.